So good morning and welcome to the 25th edition of the Telstra Connected Cycling on Video series for 2020. Yep, that's right. Next week marks the significant milestone of 6 months of consecutive Wednesday morning rides and get-togethers, connecting and listening to inspirational speakers while enjoying our ride, our walk, or even our jog, cup of coffee, or lie in bed. It's been a wonderful journey to date, and thank you all for your and to our long-term audience and our participants who have been with us along the way. Can we just go on mute, guys? Because I know your wind trainers are a very, very important part of this morning, but we do not need to hear them. So please go on mute. So this morning we're going to finish. We're going to be with the finish of the Grand Tour of all Grand Tours, the Tour de France on Monday. We'll be taking our time and going through the 21 stages of the race, not all 21, but just a conversation about the courses, the Aussies who are in the centre of everything, the winners and the incredible stories this particular Tour de France has thrown up in 2020. To get us underway on the ride this morning, please welcome our ride director, who's on leave, but he's still on his bike, of course, because he's in Melbourne, so he's still at home having a staycation. Feeling you, mate. Sandy Woolley, who's been right from the start, our race and ride director, who's here for an update. Sandy.
Thanks, Duncan, and again, welcome to everyone. I know each week we have new people joining us, so welcome to all our first-timers. It's great to have you along. If you are a newcomer and you're not a cyclist, scroll through the screen and you can actually see a screen of the ride. You can wonder why we're all huffing and puffing. That will give a bit of an explanation because we do look funny when we're sitting along on video, but that's what it's all about, and wonderful. Just a big call out. Thank you very much to adjusting to our new way of inviting you along and getting the word out there, checking in on our Facebook and LinkedIn sites. Encourage you to join that way. Check out who our upcoming speakers are. And of course, if you know someone else who'd like a bit of Wednesday pep in their step, then have them come along and join us as well. They can still hit us up at Telstra Connected Cycling at team.telstra.com. Now, I want to do a bit of a call out to a few people, a few mad people. We're all mad because we're doing what we're doing here. But there's a few who just take madness to a new level, and they're the Everests amongst us. Daniela Mollica, she did an Everest on Zwift a few weeks ago, and that wasn't good enough for her, so she then went and did it again, but she went to 10,000 kilometres. So awesome effort, Daniela, and I think you're on again this morning, probably just rolling the legs. One of our sweepers is going to have a crack at doing his own Everest challenge. So good luck, Darren. That's coming up in a few weeks. And of course, we had Petrus Lucas in New York City in Telstra, who's also going to have a crack at an Everest. So good luck with all of that, and well done, Daniela. Just lastly, Scott McGory. Thanks so much for coming along this morning. For those of you who know Scott, he's married to win 2000 Olympics. 20-year anniversary. So congratulations, happy anniversary, Scott, and great to have you along. Really looking forward to the chat this morning. 14 seconds to go, no huffing and puffing, easy out up the road. Enjoy the ride and enjoy the conversation. Back to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Sandy. And again, congratulations, Daniela. Good luck, Darren, and good luck, Petros. We're talking about the Tour de France this morning. Again, Olympic champion who's 20 years down the track from his Olympic gold in Sydney. Scott McGory is joining us. Scott was our guest speaker in Telstra Connected Cycling in week number 7 back in May. And over the past 3 weeks, of course, has given us tour updates. So as you know, he's an Olympic bronze and gold medalist on the track and rode in Europe for many years with many different pro teams in a stellar career that spanned 16 and 17 years in the saddle. So, Scotty, welcome. Let's get straight to it, mate. The 2020 Tour de France is probably going to go down as a tour for the ages, not just because of COVID, but because of the conditions it threw up. Do you feel the same way?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Duncan. Yeah, absolutely. And look, perhaps maybe not because COVID, because of everyone going through the COVID situation, but I think COVID actually contributed to why the tour was so interesting. It was so unpredictable in many ways, very challenging. I was always wondering, I was waiting for riders to just blow up at some point, get 2 weeks in and really blow up. And there were some that did that. There were some pre-race favourites that had some interesting results as they went through. Unfortunately, it was mainly the French. So Thibaut Pinot, if you remember, came in as a pre-race favourite. A lot of the discussion about this year's Tour de France, the course, was that they were trying to design it so someone like Thibaut Pinot could actually get onto the podium and maybe even win it. It was very hilly. The time trial had a hill at the end of it. All these things that would then suit Thibaut Pinot, but he completely capitulated and was out of the event. They had another one in Guillaume Martin who popped up and was running third for a while. We thought, well, hang on, we don't have to worry about Thibaut Pinot. We can focus now on Martin, and then he blew up. Romain Bardet, who came in really just to try and take stage wins. He ended up putting himself up into 4th place overall, and then crashed out. So for the French, and then Julian Alaphilippe, of course, who had the yellow jersey from the second day for a couple of days and was so good last year, he eventually faded as well. His form wasn't anything as good as it was last year. So unfortunately for the French, they're still chasing that next victory since Bernard Hinault in 1985. And I think they kind of demonstrated the unpredictability of what this year is. But in terms of the race, amazing. I think the only one that everybody compares it to is 1989. Greg LeMond beat Laurent Fignon by 8 seconds, and that was in the final stage, time trial. So now the time trial is typically the penultimate stage, and then you have the big sprint stage in Paris. In 89, they had the time trial onto the Champs-Élysées into Paris, and Le Mans overturned a 50-second deficit to an 8-second advantage. So that's the closest margin ever. It happened on the final day. It was in Paris, and those two riders swapped the yellow jersey several times throughout the tour. And Le Mans, who had just come back a year and a half earlier from being shot, it was a hunting accident. He'd been shot by his brother-in-law, had all of 1987 out after winning the Tour de France in 86. 88, he struggled to get back to form. 89, he was in a small team and won the Tour de France. So he was a little bit like Tadej Pogacar, who was in a good team, but really they didn't have to do much for him. And if he had the lead earlier, it would have been a real challenge because he wouldn't have had any riders in the mountains to help him. And Greg LeMond was in that situation in 89. He only had one rider in the mountains really to help him. So these tours, 2020 and 1989, are the two that people will talk about forever.
Yeah, I think so too, because for me as a rabid fan, I really didn't know what to expect. I really didn't know how COVID was going to upset people, because we heard the rumours that there was going to be no spectators. We heard the rumours that they were going to be put in a bubble, that they're basically the criteria of the bubble it was an ever-changing thing, that they're all going to have to wear masks on the bike. There was so much rumour and speculation coming into it that the French, and again, as you said, the French were so excited by a couple of their big-time names that this could be the time, for the first time since, 1985, that they'd have a French rider wear the yellow jersey across the line in Paris. And so, the excitement was there, but no crowds were there. And it was a tough course. Looking at it, it was a tough course. And the thing that struck me more than anything else, and I think it was one of the commentators overseas sort of said it, that they might have a winner of the Tour de France in 2020 that is actually a classics rider who can put 21 classics together, because they don't know when the Tour de France will finish because of COVID, might wrap it up early. So every stage basically was a one-day race. And so I didn't know what to think when the flag finally went. Even Christian Prudhomme, the director of the whole ASO Tour de France organisation, got COVID and had to leave the tour. So the speculation really added to the drama out of the gate.
Yeah, it did. And as a spectator, you're waiting, you're wondering. You get through that first rest day, and we had 5 positive tests for COVID, including Christian, as you mentioned. And then I find it really, I don't know, just maybe it's it's this day and age with conspiracy theories, but there were no more COVID positive tests after that. I'm not even sure if they even did the testing when they got to the second rest day. We get to the second rest day, we've got 1 week to go. Don't even worry about it. And the samples are sitting in someone's car boot somewhere in Paris, and never made it to the laboratory.
Yeah.
It was so unpredictable. And I think all of the riders, so the big name riders that were chasing overall classification, they always want to be as close to the lead as possible, but not necessarily in the yellow jersey. Not always the best way of doing it. especially if you don't think you've got a strong enough team to defend all the way to the end. Now, Primož Roglic, he had a good enough team for that. They put this team together. It was incredible. Jumbo-Visma, really, with some incredibly strong riders. So they were okay to take the lead early, but I think everyone else was just trying to be very close to him, so that if there was a rumour getting around that it looks like there's just been an outbreak within the Tour, it's going to be called off, then they were ready to pounce on the next mountain stage, because, it could have been, you know what, guys, tomorrow is going to be the end of the race, mountaintop finish, this is it, all or nothing. And if you're at 3 minutes down at that point, forget about it. There's no waiting for the third week of the Tour, and everyone was scared of the third week originally. And I think maybe that also added to Roglic. Everyone spoke about the third week. He had incredible form coming in. For a good 3 weeks, he was the best rider of all of the contenders coming into the Tour. And you think about 3 weeks out from the Tour having great form, it's not too bad. But the Tour is 3 weeks. So there's 6 weeks that he has to hold incredible form for. And while he did do a great job in those final mountain stages, it all just came undone by the last real big test, which was the time trial. No one expected him to lose almost 2 minutes to this young kid. And I do feel for him. It's absolutely thrilled for Tadej Pogačar for what he's been able to achieve. He's incredible, superstar. But for Primož Roglic, the older of the two Slovenians, he was going to be the first Slovenian to ever win the Tour de France. And just right there, the 11th hour, this young upstart kid pops up from Slovenia and puts him away. And he was very graceful in defeat. He congratulated him. They hugged after the time trial, if everybody saw that. So I think Roglic is a wonderful person, but you've got to feel for him. And it kind of reminded me of Laurent Fignon, in the yellow jersey in that final time trial in '89, crossing the line, collapsing onto the cobblestones at the Champs-Élysées, and every commentator just talking about how Fignon lost it. And for years later, until unfortunately we lost Fignon a few years ago from throat cancer, and he had been spoken to often about the guy that lost the Tour de France by 8 seconds. And he would always come back with saying, yeah, but I also won it twice.
Yeah.
And people forget
funny
that.
Funny what you get to be known for, hey? Because of that time trial, the 8 seconds, 8 seconds, and he's defined by that. So let me ask you this. With all your knowledge on the Tour and everything like that, do you reckon Jumbo-Visma blew it? And I don't mean negatively, and I'm not trying to get after him, but when you look at the cold light of day, in your opinion, as a pro cyclist, do you think they blew that? Because as you said, 6 weeks in peak condition, nobody possibly can do that without a little bit of help, you know what I mean? But how did they blow it?
In hindsight, you can say yes, because they lost the Tour. And you wouldn't be wrong. So the situation, I guess, was that they felt that a 57-second lead coming into that final time trial, if it was a flat time trial, it should have been fine. I think Roglic would have gone harder to start with. He wouldn't have been so far down. It was really, he'd lost a fair bit of time, but he was still leading by the time he got to the finishing hill. So that's where it all fell apart for him on the climb. But what they needed to do, obviously, was put more time into a rider that had no teammates. They should have been going super hard earlier on the climbs to isolate Pogačar. And then start to launch attacks, start doing something rather than just the whole Team Sky tactic of, we think we've got the strongest guy, let's go on the front and just strangle the race to death until there's no competitors left. And whoever's at the finish line, that's the deficit you'll be at the finish. But, that worked for Sky. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for Jumbo-Visma. And for me, as a pure fan, it gets a little bit repetitive, doesn't it? They're doing the same tactic over and over, throw a bit of spice into it. And I guess all they're trying to do is make it as predictable as possible. It's whatever footy. Yeah, and I like watching the one-on-one competition of AFL football, but that doesn't exist anymore. They've come up with tactics to get the best out of the game.
That's right.
So yeah, look, obviously they did blow it, but they weren't expecting it to happen the way it was going to. They thought those images of the time trial, watching they crossed to Tom Dumoulin and Wout van Aert standing together, watching the TV monitor in front of them as they can tell that Pogačar's about to beat them and Roglic was falling apart. And the looks on those two riders' faces after 3 weeks of tearing themselves apart, expecting to get the win, and they felt like it. They had their one of their team managers spoke, I think 3 or 4 days to go, as if they had won the tour. It's a formality. He'll go all right in the time trial. So utter devastation.
Yeah, I thought so too. And we're 5,000 billion kilometres away from France and stuff like that. But that's the way I was looking. And as you said, in 2020 hindsight, they could have strangled the race, and maybe we'll go with Dumoulin up the road a little bit more and put pressure on Pogacar, and sort of wiped him out a little bit. But I think we've got a photograph of the UAE team holding up their Tour de France winner, the 21-year-old Pogacar. Tell us about this team, Scotty, and this young man, because he joins the likes of Merckx, Hinault, Bernal, Fillon, as a 21-year-old winner of the Tour de France, and that's just the most perfect photograph of team unity, the excitement. Alan Piper, of course, has got one leg. We're going to talk about him in just a second, but they must be feeling no pain at the moment to be swoop in, second last stage, just drill that time trial and win the Tour de France. It's the dream come true. You couldn't write that script.
Oh, not at all. The way it worked for them is, if you were going to write the ideal way to win the Tour and put the least amount of pressure on your team, and especially if you don't think you've got the depth in your team to really defend, is exactly this way. Win it in the time trial at the last moment. And this is, Cadel Evans had a much better team around him built for the Tour de France in 2011, but that's how Cadel did it himself as well. He won it in the final time trial. A lot more pressure on Cadel throughout that tour, though. He had to do a lot more work to chase down the Schleck brothers in crucial moments. And I remember the stage that went up the Col de Glibière in particular. Cadel did an incredible ride to try and neutralise the attack from Andy Schleck. The next day was the time trial. Cadel time trial better than Schleck and went into the yellow jersey. So Pogacar really didn't have to do any of that. And the team itself, it was interesting towards the end. Like in the first mountain stages, UAE had no one there to ride in support for Pogacar. They'd all been dropped. And then the last couple of mountain stages, all of a sudden you had one or two teammates hanging in for a little bit longer. They seem to, actually, we do believe in this guy. I don't know how many of the riders did at the start, but obviously the administration of the team certainly did. And Alan Piper, Australian ex-professional, he was an integral part of that team and selecting Pogacar and the tactics. And I still find it fascinating. While we've had a few of those names you mentioned that have won the Tour at 21, that have come in as perhaps believing in themselves that they could do it, I still find it amazing that a team, it's not a month before, it's not 6 months before, it's maybe 12 months before, they think, well, you know what, we've got this 20-year-old that might actually have a chance at the Tour de France next year. Let's focus all of our preparation for the next year to put them in the best possible condition to go for it. So now he's turned 22 the day after the Tour de France. But I just find that modern technology with power meters to actually get an indication that they are going to be a possibility of doing something like win the Tour de France, which is just extraordinary for me that they're able to do that.
Yeah, no, tens of millions of euros all targeted at a 21-year-old. Fair enough. We'll get to Pogacar in a minute, but I want to talk about Alan Piper, because the Aussies are in the heart of this. And you mentioned Cadel, which is, basically the pinnacle of our involvement as Aussies at the Tour de France. And we've got such, I'm getting a coffee order from my 8-year-old son. But lucky man. But this is Alan Piper on screen at the moment, everybody. And Alan is, and I'm going to let you tell Alan's story, Scotty, because you do know him and you know him deeply. But my impressions as a fan is that this guy is just an awesome person. He influences young men and women right throughout the pro cycling world, and he has for many years. He was a great cyclist himself, but he's a perfectionist. But he's got a love for the sport and a love for the riders that beams through in anything you see on TV about Alan Piper. His passion for cycling is so infectious, and he gives so much confidence to the young men and women under his influence. So tell us about Alan Piper and how important he is to the UAE team, especially at Pogacar.
Oh, look, absolutely. He's a guy that leads by example, and that's always been the way. So as a professional rider, he wasn't at the level of Phil Anderson. I said, no disrespect to him. He was a professional in an era where English-speaking riders were very much the minority. And while Phil Anderson was our best rider of that generation, Al was a very decent rider, more of a classic style of rider than what Phil was. But the stories of Al, how he got absolutely every little bit out of himself. In the off season, I remember talking to him about, the riders would come back in the off season, and I'll mention, say, someone like Stuart O'Grady, who didn't mind a bit of a party, liked to come back to Australia and catch up with his mates, and they'd go down to the pub, and he'd have a few big weeks out with the boys. And for Alan Piper, he treated the off season, because the way he felt was, the racing season's fairly unpredictable. You're putting yourself through a lot of stress. The teams didn't have their own catering, their own chefs to prepare their food and make sure their nutrition was perfect back then. You just went to whatever hotel you were staying at a race, went to the restaurant and ate what was served. So you had no choice over your nutrition. The stresses of travel and racing. And then when you came back in the off season, that was the only time you would have a couple of months where you were in complete control of your surroundings. So that was when he was the most strict on himself. His diet was incredibly lean and clean through that period. The first week of every off season, he would fast. He would just go on a juice and vegetable processed fasting process, just to really detox and cleanse the body, to then get into, just this clean nutrition period, and then go back to Europe to then, I guess, infect the body with whatever foods and nutrition they're going to give them throughout the season. So that's the kind of mindset that he had. And every year was focused on being better for the following year. So he'd be just a couple of percentage points better each year. So he was able to get the best out of himself. That's what he tries to get into the riders now as well. But he doesn't really force it down their throats. He tries to educate them as to why you need to do it. He doesn't tell them and force them to do it, because the only way to really make it sustainable is for them to be empowered themselves. I remember he spoke about one of the teams he was with, the HTC, with Mark Cavendish. And Cav turned up. He was young. He'd already won a few stages in the tour that year. And I chatted to Al about him. I said, about Cav, hey, he's pretty good, this kid. He said, oh, yeah, but he has coffee in the morning. First thing in the morning, he has a coffee. I said, it's not good for you. You don't need to get pepped up first thing. You've got a long stage to go. You shouldn't be having honey. You shouldn't be having coffee. These are things you don't have at breakfast, because you'll have a downer in your blood sugar before you start the stage. But I can't tell him. He still has to have his coffee.
So that's all of our problems, eh? Just there. We've just learned something, everybody, that our coffee is drilling us in terms of getting on the bike. Brad Guy, you look in pain. But so thanks, Alan Piper. That's something we didn't need to know. But keep on going, Scotty. So he's a perfectionist and he's a pedant. He's a pedant. Like, he's pedantic about what he puts in his body and then how he tries to influence people. He also irons all his clothes. He's one of the only sport directors, I think, on the face of the planet who takes his own iron in his suitcase. I heard that this week. And that he irons his shirts every time. So he's very detailed orientated. He's a great person manager, whether it be a pro women's team or a pro men's team. And he's got this passion that just shines through. But he did overcome a big health challenge only about 12 months ago, didn't he?
Yeah. So he had cancer, and obviously for anyone in the cycling community, we were very concerned, very shocked. The thing with Al is he's so lean anyway. It wasn't like a shock to see him get that little bit leaner. Had he lost dramatically a amount of weight, then everyone would have been very concerned. But so he pretty much just looked the same all through that process. Got through out the other side, thankfully, and there's now been an integral part of UAE. He's someone that he's worked with Cadell, he's worked with Robbie McEwen, he's worked with so many of the Aussies, and Rowan Dennis was another one. So Rowan Dennis, who's looking to win the time trial at the World Championships this week, and he was hoping to be Olympic time trial champion by now in 2020. And when Rowan Dennis was at BMC, Alan Piper was one of the few people that Rowan respected. So Rowan, is an interesting character. He's so focused that if you get in his way on trying to achieve something, then you'll cop it. Now, as long as you help him move forward or help him try and achieve his goal, fine, come on board. And Piper was one of the very few people that could actually pull Rowan in a bit and just say, hang on, back off a little bit, go and apologise to that person. And then, unfortunately, that team folded and they went their separate ways. And then for the next season, Rowan Dennis went to Bahrain, the Bahrain Merida team, and it all fell apart because he didn't have the respect for someone, and there was no one there to pull him back into the line. He needs someone like Alan Piper by his side to keep him on the straight and narrow. He now has that. He's gone to Ineos, and he has those people, Dave Brailsford, and with the national team, he has Brad McGee to do that. But Alan Piper was very important in Rowan Dennis, getting the best out of him in those years before he went to Bahrain.
Okay, so that's Alan, and what a great influence he's had on that team, and especially on Pogačar. And we're going to talk about Pogačar in a minute. But you've just mentioned Team Ineos, and that brings up Richie Porte. So we've got a podium finish, Anna, photograph, and this is just such a good Australian story in terms of Richie Porte getting on the podium. Again, it came down to that time trial where he was behind. He was down in the rankings, but he used that to springboard himself, because he's a great time trialer, all the way into third place. So he gets on the podium behind Pogačar, Roglic. So it's Slovenia 1 and 2. Who would have thought that? Slovenia 1 and 2. And Richie Porte, and there he is in action in the time trial. This is a great story because Richie Porte is a great Australian cyclist, and he probably wasn't getting the credit from all of us in the fan base, because he was the next best thing after Cadel, but kind of didn't fulfill that promise, and the press have got after him a little bit. He's broken his collarbone and arm, a couple of crashes. And so he's had this really checkered career. But when you dig into it, mate, he's won some races, run some stages. Like, he is so prolific. And to see him on the podium is almost just desserts at the age of 34.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, 35 now too. So Richie was he's late to the sport. That was the first thing. So he turned professional at 25. He raced 2 seasons on the domestic scene in our National Road Series, and really stood out very quickly in the harder races. We had the Tour of Tasmania that he won. Here, I was working for the Victorian Institute of Sport. We had Lee Howard, who's part of our national track team now for the Olympics, and former professional on the road. He was in the lead. He lost the lead of the Tour on a big climb up to Poatina outside of Launceston. And then the next day, it was a really difficult stage, and Richie attacked, and there was a group behind chasing. Richie had in front on his own, about 20 kilometres to the finish, and he took time out of the chasing group that had the best, the next group of best riders in Australia. And I was convinced that his team car was motor pacing him up in front. How could this kid that we hadn't even really heard of ride away from all these good cyclists? Now, you fast forward all these years and think, oh, no, I think he just rode away from these good cyclists. He wasn't motor pacing at all. But that was my first thought. Surely we have to be catching him, So he came to the sport late. He came from triathlon. And the one thing that he wasn't a master at, and still isn't, is the skills, the actual just finer skills of descending in particular. And I think Richie's one thing that's happened this year that finished third was that he wasn't really in contention for the win all the way through the Tour. When he lost time when it split in the crosswinds, he was a minute 20 down. That also confirmed that he's not a guy that's likely to win it. So when they got to the top of all those mountains, most of the leaders weren't thinking, hey, we have to distance Richie on the descent. We have to put pressure on him because he might come back to bite us later in the Tour. So there was only one day where he actually got dropped by the lead group on the descent, didn't lose too much time, came in with the second group. So that was to his benefit. So he's not a bad descender. He's just not quite as good as the very best in the world. And that's what's caused some of his crashes in the past. But to come to the sport at 25, and he's won the Paris-Nice Tour twice, he's won Tour Down Under twice, he's won 8 stages of that race, he won the Criterium de Dauphiné. His race results without the Tour de France are exceptional, puts him up as one of our best ever riders anyway, but he was always being judged off the back of what Cadel had done. And Richie came along and everyone said, wow, Richie's our next guy to win the Tour de France, but he never did. So then we started to hear people, oh, Richie will never do it. No, Richie's not that good. Actually, Richie's really good. It's just that he's not as good as Cadel. And we've only ever had one Cadel in the entire history of Australian cycling. So it's vindication for Richie. To finish third, it does show what his potential was always indicating. And it's not a win. It's not replicating what Cadel did. But to finish on the podium for him, it's almost the same as a victory. I think it's a massive relief that he can retire in the future knowing that he was good enough to actually finish on the podium at the Tour de France. And of course, the big news now is while he's done that, normally you finish on the podium and you think, okay, right, next year I'm going to come back and try and win. Well, that's it. It's all over for him. He's going to go to Ineos and he's going to spend the next couple of years just working on his superannuation, getting paid millions of euros by Ineos to help others. So good on him.
I love that. And can you put that podium shot up, please, if you have it, just to share with everybody? Because, Scotty, as an Australian cyclist for so many years and investing so much, how important is this to have an Aussie on the podium at the Tour de France? You talked about Cadel and the incredible feats in 2011 and stuff like that. 9 years later, here we are. Just how important is it for the youngsters coming through to see this, to see Richie Porte on the podium?
Oh, it's crucial. From a sports perspective, it's crucial to have these kind of inspirational characters. And Cadel for me, and I wrote an article about this years ago when Cadel Evans actually retired. I said that Australian cycling isn't ready for Cadel to retire. And there you go, Richie. I was a bit concerned watching this when they came up with their face masks on. I thought, oh, come on, surely for one photo at least they get to take their masks off, which they did, which is great. But yeah, great to see Richie up there. You can see it's a genuine smile. Really, really chuffed to put himself up there. Cadel inspired so many people. He's got the somewhat unique name. First Australian to win the Tour. That was really interesting. But we didn't have the rider to take over.
Just a sec, mate. Timothy Waters, can you go on mute, please, mate? Thank you.
There you go. Yeah, so we didn't have the rider, and Richie was the one that came along next.
Yeah.
To just slip straight into Cadel's shoes and then finish on the podium the next year or 2 years later, and just keep that momentum. Because Cadel, of course, wasn't a lucky win for him. He'd been second twice. He'd been fifth as well. He'd been eighth. So we were following this wave. We're riding a wave of Cadel Evans to his victory, and that took a lot of people on board. There was a lot of recognition each Tour de France. Will he do it this time? Will he not? And eventually he did. I was hoping that someone would pop up within the next 2 years before the wave died down. And by the time Richie, this year finds himself third, I guess that general population interest in cycling and Australians within it has kind of dropped off a little bit. But despite that, Richie's not thinking about any of that. He's just trying to do his own thing. 35 now. Cadel was the oldest rider since World War II to have won the Tour at 34. So even if Richie did really go and try and focus on the Tour, with riders like Bernal coming back better next year, the youngster in Pogacar that won it this year, it's incredibly unlikely that Richie would be able to get the win anyway, even if he did now focus on it.
So Ineos, he's going to Ineos, which is a great golden handshake for the last couple of years. He's been part of some amazing teams. Like he was part of the Sky juggernaut when you had Wiggins, and then you had Froome, and then you had Geraint Thomas and stuff like that. So he's been part of these, and Ineos will be no different. So he's used to this really, really heavy-duty team with big budgets and racing every time he turn around, and big teams and stuff. So he won't be a fish out of water over an Ineos at all.
Oh no, it'll be almost like a homecoming for him. So his first contract was for Team Saxo Bank, and he was riding alongside Alberto Contador, and then went to Team Sky to help Wiggins first, and then Froome after that. Then he went to BMC, which was, he wanted to be a leader at BMC. And it was perfect for us. It was, the team that Cadel had been riding for as well. And now then to Trek. So he has been the leader, but he's also been a worker before. He's going back to be a worker again. It's with people that he knows. It's administration that he knows. And the other thing that he's used to, he certainly has been used to for the last few years, but he'd be very, very comfortable with is the salary. I'm sure the salary that he'll be on will certainly make him comfortable. He'll get used to that very quickly.
Hey, let me ask you a question, Scotty, because, as fans, we don't really always understand that some people are just not leaders. Some people just cannot handle the team. And I'm not putting that on Richie. It's just that at certain times, these stars come along, they get made the leader, and then they fade. Especially in the Grand Tours where it's 21 days, 2 rest days, all the pressure and everything like that of the World Tour or Giro d'Italia, or especially the Tour de France. And it's really fascinating to watch from a fan's point of view because, as you said, they get the big contract, they go into a big team, they're completely supported, they are the boss of that team, and then they don't produce. It must be tremendously difficult for these superstars to become the boss of a team and then not have the results that everyone's expecting.
Yeah, well, the leadership tag is an interesting one as well, because these riders, they're not. It's not typically, say, like a CEO of a multi national company. You haven't built up and earned the business nous to be the leader. These are just the best riders. It doesn't make them good leaders. They just happen to be the best riders when they go over the mountains in the time trials. And Richie is a little bit like that. He's a good guy. He's a good mate. He just happens to be the best rider in that team. It might have actually been better for him that his teammate Bauke Mollema, who was also going for the overall classification, crashed out of the tour. And then it just became, oh, well, look, we'll just focus on helping one guy rather than to have to internal fights with another rider within the team. Cadel was the same. Cadel was clearly the best rider at BMC and most of the teams that he rode for. So, and he wanted to be the leader. He wanted everybody to make sure they worked for him and helped him and did everything they could. He complained quite a lot when he was at the Lotto team about his team not being strong enough to help him. Now, they're things you don't say in public. Don't put it out there for your teammates for the first time they hear it. It's in an interview after the stage of a Tour de France that the leader of your team saying that you're not good enough to help him. That stuff hurts. It doesn't inspire your teammates to get out the next day and actually ride their guts out to help you. And Cadel didn't quite understand that. He wasn't a very good leader, but he was definitely the best rider in the team. And dare I say it, the one that I observed through my time in the media outside of racing that was exceptional at this, and I guess it's no surprise because he knew how to work people and work the room and manipulate, was Lance Armstrong. And he was a rider that I would notice him after a stage. He'd come through to the team bus, and then you could tell that he'd be looking around just to see what media, what journalists were there. He wouldn't talk to them at first. He would then towel down, pretty himself up, put his cap on, and then wait for all of his teammates to come back to the bus. They all lost several minutes, whatever. So he'd wait for all of them to return, say something to each of them. He would actually acknowledge each rider as they came through. Hey, good job today, well done. Or, hey, you're feeling a bit off today. Tomorrow's another chance. Come on, we've got it. We need you. We need you up there. I need you for tomorrow. Then he'd have a quick chat with his team, Johan Brunel. And then once all that has been done, so he'd actually ticked all the boxes of making sure his team were happy and right and content, then he went and spoke to the media. And I watch this every day and think, wow, you are certainly something special. And, he was a real leader. Now, we know he was an absolute prick as well. And, it's good that he's not involved anymore, but it's just an observation of his leadership. And then the next person, of course, that came along that I was focusing on was Cadel. And Cadel wouldn't do any of that stuff. He wouldn't go and acknowledge his team after the race. He'd go off into his own van on his own. The only time he'd see the team would be back in the hotel later at night, maybe at the dinner table. So he wasn't empowering or inspiring his teammates. But for us, thankfully, he was bloody good enough to win the race.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the different levels of leadership in terms of that intense cauldron of activity on the road and everything like that with 9 riders. It's just, there's do's and don'ts. And as a fan watching it, it's just absolutely fascinating to see the different styles of leadership. And when you're someone like a Cadel who might not have the skills in that area, and Alan Piper then becomes so important as the conduit between the other teammates and pulling for a guy who might not be a great leader. So we'll watch for Richie Port coming up with Ineos. Hey guys, I know you're all still pedaling and you've got a few minutes to go on the Zwift ride, and it looks like it's been a tough one. Jeff Coombs has been out walking and he's just seen a couple of lorikeet friends on a bridge. Where is that, mate? That looks amazing out there on the trail. Can you speak?
Just down the back of almost Northbridge. So
very nice, mate.
Nice little trail.
Yeah.
Friendly ones.
Getting a little bit of sweat too, mate. Well done. Hey, so thanks, Coombsy. You can go back on mute, mate. When we're going to be still riding along, so if anybody's got any questions about the Tour de France, and I know we all stayed up way too late watching it, and it was absolutely fascinating with the fear of COVID pulling us up at any time. So this is where we get to ask Scotty questions from the bunch. So if you've got a question, simply post your questions in the chat. We'll get to them. And, you can throw in there, hey, I got a question, and we can open the microphone up for you as well. So if you've got a question of Scotty McGory, one of our greatest cyclists and great commentators, this is your opportunity to talk about the 2020 Tour de France. We're probably not going to revisit this for too much longer in the next couple of weeks. We've got a couple of guests coming up away from cycling, which will be fascinating as well. But if you've got a question, put it in there. First one's from Ag. There you go. Nicely done. Thanks, Ag. Sagan's form. Let's talk about the yellow jersey, because Sam Bennett did an amazing job, even won on the Champs-Élysées in stage 21, the last stage. Did you see that coming? Because Sagan, there was a lot of talk about the Partie in Paris man coming up and having a real dig and winning that green jersey. He's won so many stages. He's a real pro. But his form, Ag wants to know, what's your thoughts?
Well, good morning, Ag. Sagan this year needed the support of the Brunswick Cycling Club. I think they've got such a strong community that they may have been able to help him get through. Early in the season, there was no real indication to this, but when you look back on it, early in the season, when everybody started doing Zwift races, and you had the pros turning up, and they had the Zwift Tour of Flanders and all these different things, and Greg Van Avermaet was in there having a real go at it, and people started saying, look, we want Sagan on there also, and he publicly said that he only does real bike races. He didn't want to do virtual races. Now, you fast forward to the Tour de France and you think, okay, maybe there was one rider in lockdown that wasn't as enthusiastic to get on the home trainer and slug it out like a lot of others were able to do. So perhaps, there's an indicator right there early in the season, and his dislike to virtual racing, that maybe his motivation wasn't quite there to be on form. Now, the other factor, though, is he's getting paid a suitcase full of money to ride the Tour of Italy after this. So to know that the season is so condensed, Tour de France, World Championships, and then the Tour of Italy, it would be really difficult if he was in his absolute best form for the Tour. So maybe, just maybe, nothing's been said about it publicly, but it might be that he's actually getting paid so much for the Giro that he came into the Tour at 80% and still hoping that would be good enough to win the green jersey, so that he can at least have some form for the Giro. The Giro is so hilly; it's very, very difficult, as it is every year. Typically, this year's Tour was unusual in how hard it was with the terrain. Typically, the most difficult in terms of terrain Tour of the year is the Tour of Italy, not the Tour de France. There's more flat roads normally and less transfers in the Tour de France compared to the Tour of Italy. So that's the other thing that could have been happening, was he was saving his form a little bit so that he doesn't just explode at the Giro. So we'll just have to wait and see. It would be good to come into a race like the Tour de France at 80% and still get stage placings and finish second in the green jersey. I wish I could do that. So we criticised Peter because he's been the best in the business for so long, but he was still having a go. It's just that we're just used to. Alaphilippe was the same. Alaphilippe would attack and then blow up. Last year he would attack and they wouldn't see him again. So he was also slightly off. And you can either think of it as the Giro d'Italia, the incentive for the money, or that it's just COVID-19. They're trying to train through lockdown.
He's so magnetic, Sagan. You want him in the interviews, you want him, charging over the line. But your thoughts on Sam Bennett? Great story.
Oh, what a great story. Yeah, fantastic story. Been around for quite a while, but to the Tour de France viewers, first time to see him. And the irony of all of this was, most people have already heard that, he was, the reason he missed the Tour de France for the last bunch of years is because he was in Peter Sagan's team and they weren't going to take another sprinter to the Tour. So they always took Peter. Peter got the job done. Sam had to change teams to get a start at the Tour de France and beat Peter Sagan for the green jersey. So after this final stage, there was just a little moment when they've all stopped and Sam was, being congratulated by his team, and Sagan rode past. He's in the back of the shot and he rode past, looked over with a smile and just gave him like a little wave. He didn't come over and shake his hand. He didn't give him a hug. They were former teammates. They know each other pretty well. I'm sure they got on very well together as teammates. But you could just tell Peter Sagan, he was disappointed. He didn't stop and congratulate him. It's not like Roglic doing the same to Pogacar after the time trial. He came over, he made the effort to congratulate him. Sagan gave him a little wave and then kept riding. So he'd be hurting big time.
Yeah, the GC guys probably process things at a little bit different pace than the sprinters process things after wins and after finishes and things like that. Yeah. So, because you're a sprinter for a reason. You know.
Yeah. Green jersey for an Irishman. How fitting is that? You know, 2-stage wins, winning the big one. And I watched a video yesterday, actually. It was all of the Tacony Quick Step riders talking about Sam. So their little bit on what it did. And the common theme was it may have upset the overall classification riders and everyone else in the race, because the tactics of the race changed dramatically because of the green jersey. You know, the intermediate sprint, keeping the race together or not, how it all worked, because there was this battle between Sagan and Bennett. So that really changed the way, you know, breakaways didn't get established as much this year because they were trying to keep things together for the jersey. And riders that wanted easier stages got pinged out the back on small hills because Bora were trying to get rid of Sam Bennett on those small hills because of the green jersey, not the stage itself. So it really did change the way the race was run. But each of those riders at Tacony Quick Step said that every day we had something to ride for, and it was to help Sam. So that just gave them so much motivation every day. You imagine if you're in, so B&B hotels or, you know, one of the smaller teams, Cofidis, that haven't won a stage. They've been around forever and haven't won a stage for so many years. Every day they're trying to search for something to keep themselves motivated to try and go for, you know something in the stage. Whereas you've got Tacony Quick Step, they haven't won the green jersey since 2007 with Tom Boonen. Yet every morning they got up, motivated, ready. We're doing this for Sam, and it's special for those guys. They didn't win the tour. It's a secondary competition, but that'll live with them forever. That'll, you know, the year that they beat Sagan to get green for Bennett.
Yeah, no, it was it unfolded in such a fascinating way all over the 21 days, and you know, there were races inside races inside races. Pogacar unfortunately topped about 3 races with the white jersey, the polka dot jersey, and the yellow jersey all in one, which is an incredible feat. We've got a couple of questions here. What about your commentary on the team leadership? Other than Alan Piper, Team Ineos's loss of Nico Portal, the Jumbo Visma director ousted a few days before the finish. All this seemed to have a profound impact on team dynamics and outcomes, and that's from Gareth Thomas. Thanks, Gareth.
Good morning, Gareth. There is some discussion about Ineos internally, and I've heard this from Brad Wiggins and Dan Lloyd. They were talking about the rumours of Team Ineos having some meltdowns with staff and coaching. And if you look at the way the team came into the tour, Chris Froome, you have to sort of take out of the equation because he was still coming back from his really bad broken leg last year. That was a big challenge for him to overcome, obviously, being very motivated. So it's not a coaching issue for Chris Froome. Geraint Thomas, his form wasn't great coming into the tour. There's no explanation for that, only coaching or motivation. And Bernal, who did have a crash at the Criterium de Dauphiné as a lead-up race, and just seemed slightly off, but he was okay for a while, and then all of a sudden just blew and then gave up. And there's some real internal discussions going on about the coaching and the sports science behind the scenes. And there's something going on at Ineos that wasn't quite right behind the scenes that may have led to what's happened. They came away with a stage win, and they celebrated that like they'd won the tour, first and second on a stage. But it's Ineos, you know, they've won the thing since 2012, every year bar one. So to come away with a stage win, and for the millions of dollars that are spent on it, then that was a complete failure for them. But that's good.
Your stat before was the first and second across the line were commanding €4.5 million of their budget for one stage win.
Yeah. So it cost them $4 million to get a first and second in one stage. So and Carapaz, who was second, he won the Giro d'Italia last year. He was riding for Movistar, and he was embarrassed. I know from one of the managements, he was embarrassed that his actual salary would get out and become widely known, because he was only getting a little bit over minimum wage last year by Movistar. They signed him early. He was on a couple-of-year contract, and he won the Giro earning just over minimum wage, and that embarrassed him. So he was desperate to get out of the team. That's why he went to Ineos, and I think he's €1.5 million or something now. So his salary went up slightly compared to last year. But yeah, you think about that sort of money to buy a stage win. It's an extraordinary amount of coin. But the Visma guys, they just got ahead of themselves. Jumbo Visma, They thought they were going to win. So attitude started to fill in. They'd already gotten rid of Ineos. There's no obstacles. Once you get rid of Team Ineos and Bernal, who's going to beat us now?
And they were ambushed by UAE. That was excellent. What about the Aussie team, mate? Mitchelton Scott. What do you reckon?
Mitchelton Scott. So the team with Australian DNA, but didn't have a single Australian rider in it.
That's a big deal for you, isn't it?
It is. Well, because I know where it came from. So I know it's easy to change your business model, which they've had to do, and they're still trying to find a sponsor. So as long as they've got one of Jerry Ryan's companies on the name, Mitchelton Wines is Jerry's company. It's had Bike Exchange on there, one of his companies. Jayco's been on there, even though they don't sell Jayco's in Europe. So as long as Jerry's companies are on the jersey, then they're unsuccessful in finding a major sponsor. And they've been a great team for so long. And it just shows you how fragile professional cycling is, that a team as successful as that can't attract a big sponsor in Europe. Look, the whole premise of the team to start with was to create a platform for Australian riders, which they did with majority of Australian riders to start with. And then you go to the tour this year with not a single Aussie. I know one Australian that probably should have been there in Jack Haig. But there was some internal politics. He's leaving the team next year for Bahrain. And there was internal politics. He told me that they would never put him in the team for the Tour de France. Now, Adam Yates, who did a great job, he's also leaving the team. So you can't say that we didn't put Jack in because he's leaving, which is often the case with these teams. If you're leaving the team, you don't get to ride the big one of the year before you go. But Adam Yates is leaving the team as well, and they took him there, thankfully, because he took the yellow. They came to the Tour last year to try and win overall. They didn't do that. A couple of years ago, they didn't put Caleb Bjorn in the team because they weren't chasing stages. They were just chasing the overall. So he left the team so he could get to ride the Tour de France, a bit like Sam Bennett. And now Caleb's won a bunch of stages. This year, Mitchelton came to the Tour to try and win stages. Well, if they'd kept Caleb Bjorn for the last couple of years, they would have had a bunch of victories with him. There's some little things that have happened that have changed their business model a couple of times. They should be happy with their tour because they had yellow for multiple days. So that's a great thing. So that's a really good thing. But they didn't get the stage wins that they were wanting, but they still had some great recognition from Adam Yates, and he finished right up there, top 10 in the end. So not a bad tour. But if you're going to keep saying it's the team with Australian DNA, well, then give us some Australian DNA and don't just say it. Just forget about saying that. Just say, look, we're a pro team trying to win bike races. That's what the business is all about.
Absolutely. Okay, so we got a question from the bunch. Irish Eyes are smiling with Diane Hannon and the green jersey winner Sam Bennett. It was a great tour for the Irish, Di, but you've got a question about the Giro.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm off mute.
I can.
Yep. So, Scotty, obviously at the same time as Tour de France, Giro Rosa was taking place, and it didn't quite get the same coverage, but I guess I'm just wondering if you have any perspectives or thoughts on how that played out.
Oh, there was some major disappointments in the Giro Rosa. Annemiek van Vleuten, who does ride for Mitchelton Scott, and a bunch of Aussies obviously in that one, but she was leading the race. She was by far the best, the world champion. And a couple of the stages I watched, there was one brutal stage on dirt at the finish, and there were no bunches. There were no groups at the finish. They all came in individuals, solo across the line. It was so difficult, and she smashed everyone. She's just an incredible rider, Annemiek. The World Championships last year, it was over 100-kilometre breakaway for a solo victory at the World Championships. It's just unheard of. One of the most spectacular World Championship victories, men or women, in history. She and Amanda Spratt, her teammate, both crashed out in the same crash. She was going on to win the tour. It was without question. It was a race for second, and then both of them crashed out, which also then means there's, obviously the challenges of the World Championships this week. So, and I actually haven't looked at the latest to see whether she's definitely out of the Worlds or not, but it looks like she probably will be. they seem to take it on the chin, though. The ladies, they both posed after the hospital, all bandaged up and in slings, and all these challenges, big smiles, like, oh well, we live to ride another day. And I guess there is the big dollars of the Tour de France, which comes with the massive pressure as well. I don't think the ladies have that quite as much, so they take things on the chin a little bit more. And, they'll be back to race the next race. Oh well, c'est la vie, it's no big deal. So that was disappointment for Amanda and Anna Meg. Anna van der Breggen, no surprise that she popped up to take the win then. So by default, she took over the lead and then ended up winning ahead of Kasia Niedoma and Elisa Longo Borghini. And probably my favourite rider in Cecile Utrop Ludwig, Danish rider. If you just look up her name and put in interview, you'll come up with some of the most incredible post-race interviews. Very, very.
What was the name again, mate? We'll put it in the message. We'll put it in there. What's her name?
Cecile Utrop Ludwig from Denmark.
I might just add, we've had Brodie Chapman on. She was one of our very early speakers. So Cecile is now a teammate of hers with FDJ.
Yes. I actually saw some social media stuff. Those two out riding just the last couple of days together. So they've become really good friends. But she did it was the La Course race a few years ago, where the women finished on the same climb as the men for the Tour de France stage that day. So it was the first time they got the massive crowds. So they still get crowds, but not as big as the Tour de France for the guys. And so they're finishing on the same course. And the interview post that with Cecile was just fascinating how exciting it was for her to be in that role. So the first Aussie, 23 minutes down, and that was Lucy Kennedy. Of course, she had two teammates who were trying to win the Tour, so it's a bit of a shame. And New Zealand did well, though. Michaela Harvey, she finished in 5th place or 6th place, I think it was, and she's really burst onto the scene. So New Zealand's got another gun female rider coming through the ranks as well. So interesting debate, of course, isn't it? It's Giro Rosa on at the same time as the Tour. Doesn't get the attention because the Tour's on. Should you move it? Should you not? They talk about Women's Tour de France possibly coming up. It wouldn't be the first time. They used to have the Women's Tour in the 80s. It's not as simple as people think that, well, hey, the men's race is on, just put them on the same course earlier. You've got the publicity caravan that goes ahead of the race 2 hours before. You're not using the same staff. You've got to have, obviously, 2 lots of staff, so it's double the money plus the publicity caravan. It's not a simple process to just have the women race before the men. And then does it appear then that that's the consolation race? You want them to stand alone.
That's right.
So there's a lot of discussion about how you should do it.
Okay, now we've got 6 minutes left, so we're going to rattle through these questions really quickly. They can be one-line answers, mate, and that's going to be a challenge for you, Scott McGory. It is. Okay, this is from Justin W. Are they getting younger with Hershey, Pogacar, Bernal? What's happening with the age with the Tour de France winners, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back into the 80s and then into the 90s, if you're a 21 and a talent good enough to make it into your Tour de France team, typically they'd say do the first 10 days. That's enough. Anything more than that, everybody thought you'd just blow up and you're going to burn yourself out. Aussie Will Walker rode the Tour of Spain at 19, and everyone sort of thought, oh, that's a bit dangerous. You're just going to burn him out. Whereas now these guys are so well trained. They're so well prepared. They know if they're starting to get tired. I think it's sports science and the technology with power meters, etc. That is identifying the talent younger. It's training them better, so they're in better condition earlier. And I guess the racing, one big factor. No one really likes to talk about it, but if you go back into say even the 90s and even the Lance Armstrong period, then you had a different speed of the peloton, and the young kids coming through clean couldn't keep up with Lance and his team. I think it's also an indication that the peloton is, while these kids are getting better in terms of technology, the peloton is at one speed now. It's not an A and B class, so these kids are able to survive.
Cleaner, less drugs. Tim P. Scott, any young Aussies we can be watching for as the Tour contenders for any jerseys in future?
For jerseys, for sure. There's a few guys coming through, but we had Lucas Hamilton on the stage of Trino Adriatico during the Tour while that was on over in Italy as the traditional lead-up race for the Tour of Italy. So he's a young guy coming through, but he's 24 now, I think. Jack Haig's sort of 25 25 or 26, and you've got a guy that won the Tour de France at 21. So we don't seem to have anyone that's popped up like Cadell. Cadell is just one of a kind freak, and we're still searching for the next Cadell or the next Richie. So for the overall classification, there are so few of those sorts of people that are capable of winning the Tour de France. But stages, yes, there's plenty coming through. Green jersey, maybe have to wait a little bit. It's going to be Caleb as he matures, maybe, that he could go for green. So I think we'll be hanging our hats on Caleb for quite some time. Maybe Rowan Dennis, if he rides the Tour for time trials. But in terms of the overall classification, I think we've got a little bit of a wait before we have someone pop up.
Okay. Megan wanted to correct you about Sagan when you said he only reached out once, but Sagan reached out twice after he crossed the line. So thank you very much for your fan love, Megan. Everyone loves Peter Sagan. Anyway. Sean wants to know a view on looking forward to 2021. Will Froome or Thomas be able to compete against the younger competitors like we've just talked about?
No.
Okay.
I just don't think they will. I think Geraint Thomas. So last year, people forget Geraint Thomas. I think should have won the Tour de France last year. So back-to-back wins for him. It was the stage that Bernal took the lead, the big landslide, and the stage was cut short. That particular day, Bernal attacked on the penultimate climb. It was a tactic of the team to set up Geraint Thomas to smash them on the final climb of the day. There was a valley that he had on his own. He would have had to ride through the valley into the headwind, get onto the final climb in front, and then Geraint was going to smash across to him. They may have finished first and second, but I think that was to set Geraint up for the overall win. They didn't get to that final hill. They took the time on the top of the penultimate climb. That put Bernal in the front, and then they didn't race each other on the next climbs. They had a guy in yellow. Let's not fight for it, internally. So I think Geraint Thomas would have won the Tour last year instead of Bernal. But next year, all these guys are going to get better. Geraint's just getting older. I can't see him getting back to Tour winning form. Froome's a big unknown. He's going to a team that's not going to be very strong. It'll be a very different race for him when he goes there. He's riding for Israel next year. So who knows? Coming back from an injury like he has, again, he's not getting any younger. I can't see either of them matching it with these young guys now.
Okay, last question is from Mitch. Thoughts on the rise of factor bikes? Do you have one? Would you buy one?
I think this is an offline question normally, isn't it? So that's Baden Cook's brand. He's one of the guys. Look, factor bikes are great bikes. Would I have one? Absolutely. Would I buy one? Probably not. I haven't bought a bike for a long time. But that's the beauty of being an ex-pro and having friends in the industry. Yeah, they're a very, very pretty bike. I looked at the factor yesterday. They had a gold one that they've just brought out, which was lovely. On bikes, Colnago won. So
yeah, that's right.
The bike was a Colnago.
Yeah, the first time Tour de France in 32 years or something.
Time that Colnago have won the Tour de France, which is quite interesting because they've been around for so long, an incredibly prestigious brand, and I ride one as well. I've got a Colnago. But Ernesto Colnago, and it is like Pinarello is another one in Colnago, are seen as brands that have just been around forever and very prestigious. Yet it's taken Ernesto 88 years to actually see his brand, his name, win the Tour. Unfortunately for Ernesto Colnago, he sold the company a couple of years ago. So the bike actually was made in Taiwan by a company that has combined the forces of Merida and Giant. The two bosses of the company are from Merida and Giant, and they built the traditional Italian Colnago that won the Tour this year. So it's not quite the industry it used to be, made in Italy. Yeah.
Actually, it was pretty good to see that duking it out was Colnago and Bianchi. You know what I mean? Like these two really rich. You mentioned the other one, Pinarello. I ride a Pinarello. None of that Colnago shit, thank you. But it was fascinating to see these traditional brands in a non-traditional Tour de France. Like this 2020 had so many things going into it, and not just from COVID, but just so many different factors. It was a fascinating 3 weeks, mate. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Scotty. Like, again, your insights are just so spellbinding, and your storytelling is just on point, mate. And we could literally sit here, not on our bikes, because that's good for you and I, but we could sit here all day listening. And as you can see, the smiles on everybody's faces in the Brady Bunch type photograph. You know, you've done the job for us again. And we thank you so much for your support of Telstra Connected Cycling, mate. You come on free of charge. You're a real pro at everything you do in terms of the media and your insight and and your background in cycling, and we are the beneficiaries. So thank you, mate. You're a real champion of the game, and you're a real champion for us at Telstra Connected Cycling. So thank you, mate.